Some love stories begin with a dramatic moment, a glance across a crowded room, a rescue in a storm, a letter delivered by moonlight. This one began with an argument about a chicken. Not a metaphorical chicken, an actual chicken. Specifically, the one belonging to May Whitfield that had somehow crossed the property line onto Jack Calloway's land for the third time that week, and Jack's entirely reasonable opinion that a chicken with that much ambition ought to pay rent. May's opinion was different. May's opinion, delivered from the other side of the fence with the kind of cheerful precision that suggested she had been waiting for exactly this argument, was that the chicken was not trespassing. The fence was simply in the wrong place and had been since Jack's father built it 20 years ago. And if Jack had any interest in accuracy, he might consider moving it approximately 4 feet to the left. Jack considered this. Then he said that if May had any interest in keeping her livestock on her own property, she might consider building a chicken that could read a property line. May laughed, not politely, not to be kind. A real laugh, the kind that escapes before you can stop it, bright and genuine and entirely delighted. And Jack Calloway, who had been mildly annoyed approximately 30 seconds ago, found himself doing something he hadn't planned. He smiled. Not the polite smile of a neighbor, the other kind. The kind that means something has just arrived that you weren't expecting and you are not entirely sure what to do about it. Ridgeback, Montana, 1881. Jack Calloway was 32 years old and ran the family cattle ranch, 300 acres of good grazing land on the eastern slope of the valley, a solid barn, a house that needed some work on the porch, and enough cattle to be comfortable without being prosperous. He was broad-shouldered, dark-haired, with the kind of face that looked like it had been made for the outdoors, not exactly handsome in the arranged way, but honest-looking, which in Montana counted for more. He was also, by general consensus of Ridgeback's small population, the most stubborn man in the valley. Not mean stubborn, just certain. He had opinions and he had arrived at them carefully, and he saw no particular reason to revise them without compelling evidence. This quality served him well in cattle ranching. In other areas of life, it had produced mixed results. May Whitfield was 28, the daughter of the neighboring property, 40 acres of good land, a kitchen garden that was the envy of the county, and a hen named Duchess, who had opinions of her own. May had run the property alone since her father's death 2 years ago, which had taught her several things. How to fix a fence post, how to negotiate with merchants who assumed she didn't know what things cost, and how to have a conversation with someone who was being unreasonable without letting him know she found him unreasonable. This last skill had proved particularly useful with Jack. They had been neighbors for 20 years, the Calloway and Whitfield properties separated by a fence line, a creek, and the accumulated history of two families who got along well enough and occasionally drove each other completely mad. May brought over a pie when Jack's father died 3 years ago, because that was what you did. Jack fixed the soft section of her north fence without being asked, because that was also what you did. They had an unspoken agreement of mutual practical support that worked smoothly as long as nobody's livestock crossed the property line, which brought them to the chicken. "She's very determined," May said, watching the chicken in question peck at the ground on Jack's side of the fence with complete satisfaction. "She's trespassing," Jack said. "She's exploring." May tilted her head. "You could learn something from her, actually. She sees a boundary, and she thinks, is this boundary serving anyone? And if the answer is no, the answer is yes. It's serving me. It's keeping your chicken on your side." "Clearly not," May said pleasantly. Jack looked at the chicken. The chicken looked at Jack with the serene indifference of an animal that has no concept of property law. "I'll build it higher," Jack said. May smiled, that particular smile of hers that meant she had already won the argument and was being gracious about it. "You do that," she said. "I'm sure that will solve everything." She picked up the chicken, tucked it under her arm with the ease of long practice, and walked back toward her property. Jack watched her go and thought, that woman is the most aggravating person in the valley. He thought this with, he would later admit, considerably more warmth than the word suggested. The chicken incident was, as it turned out, not an isolated event. It was the opening chapter of what became, over the following months, one of the most entertaining ongoing disputes in Ridgeback's history. It was never serious. That was the thing. It had the quality of a game that both players understand is a game, each side fully engaged, neither side actually angry, the whole exercise conducted with the kind of energy that only exists between people who are, on some level, enjoying themselves enormously. The chicken crossed the fence twice more. Jack built the fence higher. May brought the chicken back both times, on the second occasion accompanied by the observation that she admired his commitment to a strategy that wasn't working. There was the matter of the water rights at South Creek, which they resolved at the county office after a 40-minute discussion in which they agreed on every practical point and disagreed on every principle, and left the clerk visibly confused about whether they were fighting or not. There was the afternoon Jack's horse got into May's kitchen garden and ate approximately a third of her squash crop, which produced a conversation of considerable quality, May's position being that Jack owed her squash, Jack's position being that the horse had shown better taste than most guests he'd entertained. May's response to that was a look of such composed incredulity that Jack had to turn away to avoid laughing. He paid for the squash. Double, because it seemed right. The town noticed. Towns always notice. "You spend a lot of time at the Whitfield fence," said Jack's friend Tom, with the careful neutrality of someone delivering information he knows will be received poorly. "We have shared water rights," Jack said. "You also," Tom said, "have been to the shared water rights location 11 times in the past 2 months. I'm not saying anything. I'm just noting." Jack told him there was nothing to note. But that evening, sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun go down over the valley and the light turn everything gold, he found himself noticing that May's lamp was on across the property, and he found himself, without any particular decision being made, glad that it was. Ridgeback was a small town. Small towns have a particular relationship with information. It moves faster than horses, arrives more accurately than the telegraph, and comes with commentary already attached. The information currently in circulation was that Jack Calloway and May Whitfield were either about to get married or were conducting a feud of historic proportions, and the town was divided approximately evenly on which interpretation was correct. Martha Deere, who ran the dry goods store and had an opinion about everything, held firmly to the marriage theory. "I've seen the way he looks at her when she's not looking," she told anyone who would listen. "That man is gone and doesn't know it yet." Old Pete, who had known both families for 30 years, took the feud position on grounds that the Calloways and the Whitfields had always had strong opinions and the apple didn't fall far from the tree. The consensus eventually was that both things were probably true, and the town would simply have to wait and see which one won. May was aware of the speculation. She was not by nature a woman who paid much attention to what people said about her. She had learned, running a property alone, that other people's opinions of her choices were rarely useful and frequently wrong. But she was also honest with herself in the way she tried to be honest about most things. She liked Jack Calloway, not despite the arguments, because of them, because he never talked down to her, never softened his actual opinion to be polite, never treated her like a woman who needed to be managed rather than engaged. When he disagreed with her, which was often, he said so directly and expected her to disagree back, which she did, and somehow this felt more like respect than any number of careful courtesies. She liked his laugh. She liked the way he thought things through slowly and then held his conclusions firmly. She liked that he had paid double for the squash without being asked. She was not, however, going to be the one to say any of this first. She had her principles. It was October when it happened, the harvest social at the Ridgeback Grange Hall, fiddle music, too much food, and the particular atmosphere of a community that has gotten through another summer together and is feeling generous about it. May was there with her neighbor Ruth. Jack was there because Tom had told him he'd been spending too much time alone, which was becoming a pattern of advice Jack was receiving from multiple directions. They found each other, as they generally did, in any room without particularly looking. "May," he said. "Jack," she said. "That chicken behave herself this week?" "Exemplary. She's been entirely on her own side of the fence. I think she's lost interest now that you built it higher. Or she's planning something." "Almost certainly," May agreed seriously. "I'd watched the south section." They stood together at the edge of the dancing and talked easily, the way they always talked, with the particular rhythm of two people whose conversations had developed their own grammar over months of practice. Ruth caught May's eye from across the room and made a face that May chose to ignore. A young man named Carter, recently arrived in Ridgeback and not yet aware of the existing order of things, made his way over and asked May to dance. May glanced at Jack. Jack was looking at Carter with the expression of a man who has just noticed something he does not entirely welcome and is deciding what to do about it. He recovered quickly, smiled. "Go ahead," he said pleasantly. "At this rate, you'll never get married, May. You should take every opportunity that presents itself." He meant it as a joke, the friendly, teasing kind, the kind they traded constantly, the kind that was their particular language. May looked at him. Something in her expression shifted, just slightly, just for a moment. Then the smile came back, not the public one, the real one, the one that meant she had seen something he hadn't shown on purpose. She took one small step closer to him and said quietly, so only he could hear, "Not unless you ask." Then she turned to Carter and said perfectly pleasantly, "Thank you, but I think I'll sit this one out," and walked away toward the refreshment table as if nothing had happened. Jack stood where she had left him. Carter looked at him. "Was that?" "Go dance with someone else," Jack said, without looking at him. He was watching May at the refreshment table, her back to him, entirely composed, and he was thinking about 3 words delivered with a smile and a step, and the particular calm of a woman who has just said exactly what she meant and is perfectly comfortable with it. He walked home under the stars, not because he lived far, because he needed the air. "Not unless you ask." He turned it over the way he turned over everything, carefully, from every angle, with the honest stubbornness that was his best quality and his most inconvenient one. She had been saying it, he realized, for months, not in words, in the way she stayed at the fence longer than the conversation required, in the way she laughed at things he said that other people found merely adequate, in the way she had looked at him across the dance floor with that real smile. The one he'd started to understand was different from the one she gave everyone else. He had been treating it as banter. She had been telling him something. He stopped walking in the middle of the road. The stars were very clear. Montana in October has the best stars, cold air, no clouds, the Milky Way laid out like someone had spilled salt across a black table. He thought about the chicken, the squash, the water rights, 11 visits to South Creek, the lamp in her window that he'd started looking for every evening without realizing he was doing it. He thought about Carter and the specific quality of the feeling he'd had watching Carter walk toward her. That feeling had a name. He'd been avoiding giving it a name for months, the way you avoid looking directly at something bright because you know once you see it clearly, you can't unsee it. He looked at it directly now. He stood in the road for a long time. Then he walked home, went inside, sat at the kitchen table, and spent a considerable amount of time thinking about how a man who prided himself on being direct had managed to be this thoroughly indirect for this long. The answer, he eventually concluded, was that he'd been afraid, which was an uncomfortable thing to conclude about yourself at 32 in Montana under excellent stars. He went to bed. He didn't sleep much. In the morning, he had a plan. He went to her property on a Sunday morning, not with flowers, that felt like a performance, and Jack Calloway did not perform. He went with a fence post and a post hole digger, because the southeast corner of her fence had been soft since July and he'd been meaning to fix it, and it seemed suddenly like a reasonable excuse to be where he wanted to be. She was in the kitchen garden when he arrived. She looked at the post hole digger. "Southeast corner," he said. "I know," she said. I've been meaning to get to that. I'll do it. You don't have to. I know, he said, which was what she always said to him, and she recognized it, and the corner of her mouth moved. He fixed the fence post. She brought him coffee. They sat on the low fence rail in the October morning and drank it in the comfortable silence that had always been available to them, the silence that felt like company rather than absence. Then Jack set down his cup and said, I've been thinking about what you said at the social. Have you? She said, neutral, giving him nothing. I was slow, he said. I want to acknowledge that directly. I was considerably slower than I should have been, given that you have been, he paused, choosing words, quite clear, in retrospect, for some time. Several months, she said helpfully. Several months, he agreed. I was going to say I had reasons, but they're not very good reasons, and you have a reliable instinct for bad reasoning, so I won't waste your time. She turned to look at him. Her expression was doing several things at once, amused and patient, and something warmer underneath both. What I want to say, he said, is that I'd like to come calling on you properly, if you're willing, starting with supper this week, if that suits. It suits, she said. Then, Jack. Yes. That was the least romantic declaration of intent I have ever heard in my life. He looked at her. Was it wrong? No, she said. It was exactly right. She picked up her coffee. Which is, I suppose, why I've been waiting for it. What followed was, by general agreement, the most entertaining courtship Ridgeback had witnessed in living memory. Not because it was smooth, because it wasn't. They argued about the best way to store winter grain. They had a disagreement about horse management that lasted 3 days and was resolved only when May's mare did exactly what May had predicted, at which point Jack conceded with the specific grace of a man who has learned that conceding to May Whitfield is actually not as painful as anticipated. They also, in between the arguments, had suppers that lasted 3 hours because the conversation refused to end. They rode out together on Sunday afternoons and talked about everything, the ranch, the future, the small things that accumulate into a life. They discovered that they agreed on most of the things that actually mattered and disagreed on most of the things that didn't, which was, May observed, probably the ideal arrangement. You know, Jack said one evening on her porch, most couples agree on things. Most couples are bored, May said pleasantly. He thought about this. Fair, he said. Martha dear, informed of the official courtship, said simply, finally, and returned to her dry goods without further comment. Tom bought Jack a drink and said nothing, which was the most eloquent response Jack received. One Sunday in November, they sat on the ridge above the valley, the one with the view west, the mountains behind them, the golden grass below. And Jack said, without preamble, you know what I like best about you? My fence-fixing opinions. You never let me be lazy, he said. About thinking, about anything. You make me actually engage with things instead of just deciding. He looked at the valley. I didn't know I needed that until you. She was quiet for a moment. You know what I like best about you? She said, you actually listen. Even when you disagree, you listen first. She looked at him. That's rarer than you think. He looked back at her. The valley was gold below them, and the mountains were doing what they always did, and something between them that had been a game for months settled quietly and completely into something else entirely. He asked her in December on her own porch, on a cold clear evening with the first snow on the mountains and the last of the sunset turning the sky 3 colors. He had thought about elaborate settings, rejected them all as inconsistent with everything he knew about May, who had no patience for things that were more about presentation than content. He sat in the chair beside hers, the chairs they'd been sitting in all autumn, the chairs that had become, without any formal decision, theirs, and turned to her. May, he said. I need to ask you something. You need to ask me several things on a regular basis, she said, not looking up from her coffee. Be specific. I need to ask you to marry me." She looked up. He held her gaze. This woman who had argued with him about a chicken and water rights and horse management and the proper storage of winter grain, who had made him laugh more in 6 months than he had in the previous 3 years, who had said, "Not unless you ask," with a smile that had kept him awake for a week. "I'm not going to be poetic about it," he said. "You'd see through it anyway. What I know is that I want to argue with you for the rest of my life, and have coffee on this porch, and fix your fence posts, and lose approximately 40% of our disagreements." 50%, she said. 40, he said firmly. She looked at him for a long moment. "Jack Calloway. Did you just try to negotiate the terms of your own marriage proposal? I'm establishing an accurate baseline." She laughed, that Real laugh, the one that had started everything, bright and genuine and entirely delighted. Then she set down her coffee and looked at him with everything she'd been carrying for months, all of it visible now, nothing held back. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes. It took you long enough." "I was thinking it through," he said. "You're always thinking things through. And yet here I am." "Here you are," she said softly. Finally. They were married in April, when the valley turned green. The ceremony was at the Ridgeback Church, small and genuine, with the people who mattered and nobody who didn't. May wore a cream dress her mother had made years ago, kept in a trunk for exactly this occasion, which her mother had apparently been considerably more confident about than May had been. Jack stood at the front of the church and watched May walk toward him and thought, with the clarity that sometimes arrives at important moments, that he had spent 6 months arguing with this woman, and that every single one of those arguments had been, in its own way, a conversation he didn't want to end. He intended to have a great many more of them. They combined the properties, which required several practical conversations about land management that occasionally became arguments and were always resolved, because that was how they worked. The ranch grew. May's kitchen garden expanded. The accounts, which May kept, were considerably better organized than they had been under Jack's management, a fact he acknowledged without significant resistance because the numbers were simply correct. Their first child arrived in the 2nd year, a boy they named Robert, who had his father's jaw and his mother's instinct for finding exactly the right thing to say. He also had, as became apparent early, his mother's talent for arguing and his father's stubbornness, which produced a childhood of considerable energy. Their daughter came in the 4th year. They named her Helen, after May's mother. She was quieter than her brother, watchful and funny in the dry way that May had always been, with her father's patience underneath it. The years settled into the rhythm of a life built by two people who were genuinely good at being together, not because they agreed on everything, but because the disagreements were honest and the resolutions were real, and neither of them had any interest in performing a version of their marriage for anyone else's benefit. The chicken, for the record, lived to an implausible age and was buried with some ceremony in May's kitchen garden, which Jack maintained was excessive and May maintained was the appropriate recognition of a historically significant animal. They disagreed about this until the end. The summer of 1931, the ranch had changed, grown, aged, passed through seasons of prosperity and difficulty and back again the way ranches do. The barn had been rebuilt twice. The porch had been repaired so many times it was practically a different porch. The valley below was the same valley. The mountains, the same mountains, indifferent and faithful. Jack Calloway was 82 years old. May was 78. They sat on the porch in the late afternoon, in the chairs that had been replaced several times but were always somehow the same chairs, facing west, the view they had looked at together for 50 years, the mountains catching the last of the sun on their high peaks. Jack had a cup of coffee. May had tea. This had been a point of mild contention for approximately 4 decades. "You know," Jack said, looking at the mountains, "coffee is objectively the better choice in the evening." "You've been saying that for 50 years, May said. "It hasn't become less true." "It hasn't become more true either," she said pleasantly. He looked at her, this woman who had argued with him about a chicken on an October afternoon in 1881, who had said, "Not unless you ask," with a smile that had changed the direction of his entire life. 78 years old, her hair gone silver, her face carrying 50 years of weather and laughter and the particular marks that a life fully lived leaves on a person. Still the most interesting person in any room she entered. Still the one he wanted to talk to about everything, argue with about everything, sit in comfortable silence with on evenings like this one. "May," he said. "I've been thinking." "Dangerous," she said. "I've been thinking that I was right, that October at the social, when I said you'd never get married at that rate." She turned to look at him. Her eyes still had that quality, green, gray, depending on the light, depending on what she was thinking. "Because," he continued, with the careful precision of a man delivering a well-constructed argument, "you were not going to get married unless I asked," which means the statement was technically accurate. A pause. "Jack Calloway," she said. "Are you claiming credit for our marriage on a technicality?" "I'm establishing an accurate historical record," he said. She laughed, the same laugh 50 years later, still the same laugh, the one that had started everything that October evening, bright and real and entirely delighted. She reached over and took his hand on the armrest between them, the way she had 10,000 times, and they sat together in the last of the afternoon light and watched the sun go down over the valley they had built a life in. The mountains did what they always did. The valley held them the way it always had. And two people who had argued about a chicken and water rights and winter grain and the proper number of fence posts and coffee versus tea sat in the gold of the evening and were, as they had been for 50 years, exactly where they were supposed to be. Jack and May never had a grand moment. No rescue, no dramatic declaration, no single scene that you could point to and say that's where it started. It started with a chicken. It continued through water rights and squash and 11 visits to a creek. It found its shape in the particular grammar of two people who argued honestly and listened well and never once pretended to be something they weren't. That's the thing about humor and banter. When it's real, when it's the kind that both people are playing equally, it's not deflection, it's intimacy. It's two people saying, "I see you clearly enough to tease you, and I trust you enough to let you tease me back." Jack and May talked to each other for 50 years. They disagreed for 50 years. They laughed for 50 years. And every evening on that porch, they watched the sun go down over the same valley and held the same hands. I don't know a better definition of a good life than that.